Well, hello again, and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Tim Alston, and I am the host of actually two weekly podcasts. The first podcast is this one on Mondays. It's called The Tim Alston Show. The second podcast will be on Thursday afternoon, the same time, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. There is a common theme that runs through the both of them, each of them, and that theme are two objectives. Number one, we are here to educate, to empower, and to equip you as emerging leaders, and you are an emerging leader, with God thought leadership. And our second objective is always to present current events and newsmakers in the light of best practices from the Bible. And today is no exception. We're going to talk today about, and my subject will be entitled Celebrating Two April 17th Milestones and celebrating them today. Yes, I know. Today is Monday, April 14th, 2025, but I'd like for us for today, for this afternoon, to focus in on two milestones that will be happening later this week that are very impacting and that are great lessons for us, life lessons for us as emerging leaders. You've often heard me talk about the fact that you are a leader, not because of your position, not because of your title, but you are a leader because of two main ingredients. You have influence and you have relationships, and that's what makes you a leader. Okay, so today, again, we're going to be talking about a future event, but it has some immediate implications for us. On Thursday, April 17th, we will be celebrating two milestones. Number one, we will be celebrating Holy Thursday, which is a part of the Passion Week, as we who are Christians or practicing Christians seek to celebrate and commemorate the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we're also going to be talking about April 17th, which is also designated as National Ellis Island Family History Day. National Ellis Island Family History Day. But let's just focus on one celebration at a time. Once again, as I said, today is Holy Thursday. Now, as you may know, we are in the midst of celebrating Passion Week. We began with Palm Sunday. Now it's Holy Monday, Holy Tuesday, Holy Wednesday, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Sabbath, and then Easter Sunday, where we talk about the transition and the pathway leading to the crucifixion, the death, and later the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Throughout the whole Christendom or the Christian world, we celebrate that. And we celebrate it because it is significant to us, because Jesus Christ is significant to us. And so before we get to Good Friday, there is Holy Thursday. On Holy Thursday, the event that occurred back in history, according to the Bible, was the Last Supper in the upper room. That was the event that happened then. And the significance of that for us as emerging leaders is we saw from Jesus a demonstration of what was arguably one of the greatest teaching moments of being a servant. As you may remember the accounts in the Bible, it was in the upper room that there was the Last Supper, and Jesus laid out again for his disciples, the 12 of them, what was going to be transpiring later on that week with his mock trial, with the conviction, with the guilty sentence, also with the crucifixion, his death, and later his resurrection. As part of the Last Supper observance, there was a small dilemma that was happening. Let me give you a little more pretext before I go to the context. During that week, Jesus and his disciples came into Jerusalem and were beginning the process of moving toward, as I said, the trial, the crucifixion, death, and resurrection. But prior to that week, on the way, en route to Jerusalem, the disciples were discussing who was going to be in what positions of prominence in Jesus' earthly kingdom. Now, Jesus had never indicated to them or anybody else that he was setting up an earthly kingdom. But that was in their minds because it met their level of self-interest. And they were jockeying for positions in their mind, but the games had already begun. For example, the brothers, James and John, called the sons of thunder, had the nerve, mama's boys, to invite their mother to come and lobby to Jesus for her sons, James and John, to sit on the left hand and the right hand of Jesus in his earthly kingdom. Now, you know that really, really pissed off the other 10 disciples. But Jesus did not get flustered, did not try to argue with them or anything like that. What Jesus was going to tell them is what he told them later on. But let's go back to those disciples again. I mean, the hubris, the arrogance of them, and think about it. And I like to think about it. Based upon what we knew about their personalities, who do you think would be vying for which position? I have my idea in my head. I'm thinking, for example, of Simon Peter, since he claimed to be such the diplomat. He was probably jockeying, felt that he was entitled to the position of Secretary of Defense. And then you've got Doubting Thomas, who from his questioning spirit and his sense of interrogation probably saw himself as Attorney General. You probably have Levi Matthew, because of his background as a tax collector, saw himself as either the Commerce Secretary or the Treasury Secretary. And that is if Judas Iscariot would take one of those positions that he may have felt would have been beneath him. Now, back to those sons of thunder. They probably felt that because of their position, that they probably either should be both vice presidents or co-secretaries of defense. I mean, this was what's crazy mind. And then Peter, on second thought, probably said to himself, well, I should probably, because of who I am, be considered the Secretary of Homeland Security. And so they were probably jockeying back and forth. They thought they were out of earshot of Jesus. But Jesus turned to them later on and said, guys, what were you all talking about? And they tried to get hush on. And he said, look, he dropped the pearl of wisdom on them and said, he who is greatest among you, let him be the servant. And it was in that context and against that backdrop, we now go back to the upper room. There was no servant there in the room, and it was customary in that culture that when you rented a room, in the rental fee came a servant who would wash the feet of those who were to occupy the room. Now, the disciples felt that that wasn't in their pay grade. They could not consider themselves to be that lowly. But Jesus, ever the teacher, ever the leader of men, what Jesus did, according to Bible accounts, he disrobed, took a towel, wrapped it around his waist, got one of the empty basins beside him, filled it with water, and began the process, nonverbal process. Didn't say a word, but his actions spoke. And he then began to wash their feet. 24 stinking feet. And I say stinking feet because in those days, there were no paved roads, there were no automobiles, and everything transported itself on those roads, all the dust, all the dirt, all the animal droppings, and they had to walk through all that. So you can imagine the job Jesus had to do. Now, in my imagination, now this is not exegesis, this is what you would call, Tim Olson, eisegesis. I wonder who was the first disciple whose Jesus' feet washed. But I have a sneaky feeling in my head, and there's no Bible on this, this is just my thinking, that the last two disciples' feet that he washed were Simon Peter and Judas Iscariot. Challenge me if you will, that's fine. Let's have some discourse about it. And Jesus washed all their feet. And that was one of the greatest examples that we as emerging leaders can have. Jesus showed them that you lead by serving, but more importantly, you serve by leading. That was the message Jesus got across to his disciples when he washed their feet. And that was a very powerful example for them because they needed to know practically what was laying ahead for them. Now, after the crucifixion, after the death, after the resurrection, Jesus then took these self-consumed, arrogant, self-important disciples on a 40-day leadership development intensive program before he left the earth and introduced them to his successor, the Holy Spirit, who was the Comforter. They were changed men after that event. You have to remember now, the Bible uses the number 40 to symbolize a period of testing and preparation. And that was the case with those disciples. And that training worked, and they helped to change the world. Jesus helped in that instance, in those instances, both with the foot washing and the 40-day intensive leadership development program, to help to break them from that self-confidence and to elevate them and graduate them into God confidence. Now, that is a similar lesson to what we now see and what we now can see in that second milestone. We've already talked about the first milestone, that Holy Thursday celebration and teaching moments. But now the second milestone was that of National Ellis Island Family History Day. Did you know, you may or may not have known, that on that date, April 17th in the year 2007, that day represented the single largest number of immigrants to have been processed into the United States through Ellis Island. Some 11,747 immigrants were processed that day onto that little 27-acre island called Ellis Island. Now, Ellis Island, for the sake of geography, in New York Harbor, Ellis Island was a little less than a mile away from the nearby Statue of Liberty. But they were worlds apart in terms of their purpose for these new immigrants. Like I said, there were 11,747 who were processed on that day. But overall, between 1892 and 1954, those years of Ellis Island, some 12 million immigrants came through and were processed, coming from Eastern Europe and Africa and Jamaica. And I say that because it is very easy for us to assume from the pictures that we see that the only people that came through Ellis Island were those who were white and Eastern European, but that is not an historical fact. I mean, we know a number of those luminaries, American legends who came through Ellis Island. For example, you had the scientist, Albert Einstein, and Isaac Asimov. You also had the comedian Bob Hope. You also had the actor Cary Grant come through there, and you had the composer Irving Berlin. But who also came through there was, through Ellis Island, from Jamaica, was that Harlem Renaissance writer Claude McKay. And also from France, through Ellis Island, came the dancer, singer, and actress Josephine Baker. And, for example, through Ellis Island, from Africa, more specifically Ghana, came Kwame Nkrumah, who went from Ellis Island to Lincoln University, the HBCU in Pennsylvania. And ultimately, he became the president of independent Ghana. And by many, he is considered to be the father of Pan-Africanism. And so I want you to understand the fact that Ellis Island really was a case study in diversity and inclusion, and also definitely in the realm of equity. And so, in fact, today, as we talk about issues of immigration and the foolishness about deportation, understand the fact that 40% of us Americans, 40%, approximately 130 million Americans, can trace their heritage back through Ellis Island. Okay, so what am I saying? That the fact that there is a lesson to be learned in terms of leadership in comparison and drawing a parallel between Ellis Island versus the Statue of Liberty and self-confidence versus God confidence. What do I mean? When these immigrants, when these 12 million immigrants came to the United States, as their boats pulled in and pulled through the New York harbor, the first thing that they saw to let them know that they were here in the land of opportunity, the first thing they saw was Lady Liberty standing there in New York harbor, 305 feet tall, towering over New York harbor. That to them symbolized the ultimate goal for them being here was the freedom and unbridled, unlimited opportunity. But before they could get to the Statue of Liberty, they were required, all of them, to pass through Ellis Island, which was at that time the chief U.S. immigration station of disembarkation. They had to go through there to get processed. Now, what's interesting is that they were right there together, close, almost a mile apart from each other, two separate islands in New York Harbor, but their roles were very different. For example, an interesting piece of trivia that I learned is that during that time, during those 60 years, 62 years actually, from 1892 to 1954, the process of screening, of cataloging, of giving them health and medical examinations was about a 3 to 5 hour process. But in that time, over those 60 years, there were some 350 babies born, actually born during that disembarkation stage at Ellis Island. It's amazing. But the biggest thing is the fact that even though those babies were born there, that was not to be their home, either for those newborns or their families. You see, Ellis Island was simply the first step in the process of becoming Americans and taking advantage of the land of opportunity, the land that they've been praying to God about. So what do I mean? That even though the people who came over on those ships brought everything they owned with them, Ellis Island was just a rest stop on the journey to and through America. What does that mean? Is that though this represented to them freedom like they'd never seen before, they were not allowed, for example, to plant gardens of fruits and vegetables there on Ellis Island. It wasn't their home. They weren't allowed to hang curtains in the Ellis Island hall. It wasn't their home. They weren't allowed to hang family mementos on the walls. It wasn't their home. It was just, the stopover place for them. It was just to get them started. What am I saying? In our development as emerging leaders, we need to understand the difference between Ellis Island versus Statue of Liberty and self-confidence versus God confidence. Let me break it down a little bit further. The first step in our leadership journey is self-development, self-confidence, self-pride, self-actualization, self-esteem. That is the very first and necessary step. But here's where the problem comes in. Unfortunately, too many of us get stuck, get rooted, become immovable on self. The problem with that is that if we never move beyond that, see, self-actualization, self-pride, self-esteem, self-worth, self-awareness, those are limiting steps. Those are limiting steps over us. And we can never move above them if we just get stuck on self. But the ultimate goal for those immigrants was to move from Ellis Island to Lady Liberty, and not just that statue, but into America where there was opportunity. But the first step had to be Ellis Island. Are you with me? My first step has to be self-development, has to be self-esteem, has to be self-confidence. But we get stuck there and we can't afford to stay there. We have to graduate and move ourselves into the realm of not self-esteem, but graduate to Christ esteem, not just self-confidence, but God confidence, so that we can become all that we need to be and become all that we are supposed to be. So the reason I say that these two are two very key and pivotal milestones for us in terms of the Last Supper, Holy Thursday of Passion Week, and Ellis Island, is they become very key lessons for us, key teaching moments for us, that we must graduate into servant leadership and move from that self-confidence, that self-actualization, into God confidence. When the disciples saw that lesson of Jesus washing their feet, when they had that 40-day leadership development tutorial program before Jesus ascended to heaven, they were very much caught up in themselves. But as they began to grow and listen to what he said and follow his examples, they then were released to the world, and it worked. They became less and less self-confident, more and more God-confident. As a result, they set the world on fire. And Christianity today is the world's largest religion with 2.56 billion people. Why? Because their leaders moved from self-confidence to God confidence. And so my point to you today is we need to be in pursuit, first of all, of moving away from our being fixed on self and move to being fixed on God. That is our only hope. As we watch events in the news, as we watch events all around us, we can't trust man. We can't trust things. We can't trust persons. We can't trust policies, because all of them are limited, like the limitations of self-esteem, self-control, self-awareness, self-confidence. We need to move ourselves one by one, little by little, bit by bit every day into God confidence. So what I like to say is, let's start with your and my Ellis Islands of self, but then you and I must move rapidly to the statues of liberty, of that ultimate freedom, which is our freedom in God. Thank you for listening. I hope that you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something from this. I hope that this has been meaningful to you, portable to you, personable to you, and that you will grow from this experience. Again, I hope that you liked what you heard, that you will share it, that you will like, share, and subscribe to it. And join me on Thursday for the 10 Commandments of Leadership. And on those shows on Thursday, we take a deeper dive into the issues of leadership and how to become better leaders as we are emerging leaders. Thank you. And again, I leave you with the words of Philip Brooks, who was an 18th century American Episcopal clergyman and author. He said, don't ask for an easier life. Instead, ask to be a better, stronger person. He said, don't ask for a task equal to your power. Instead, ask for power equal to your task. And then the work you'll do will not be a miracle. You will be a miracle. This is Tim Alston signing off. I want to thank again our sponsor, Shoeshine Media, the video graphic services company in Nashville, Tennessee, with offices also in Atlanta and in Huntsville. And remember, if this information is becoming to you, then you should be coming to me. Let me hear from you. You can reach out to me directly on my email at info@timalston.com. And until next time, thank you, and we'll see you later.